Every crisis feels temporary. A recession, a market crash, a war, a pandemic. We're told the same thing every time. This is an emergency. Extraordinary measures are necessary. Once stability returns, everything will go back to normal. But here's the unsettling truth. Nothing ever goes back to normal. After every crisis, a new policy stays. A new power remains. And somehow, the institutions meant to stabilize the system always walk away stronger. This video asks the question we read discouraged from asking: how did temporary crisis management become permanent financial control? Why does every collapse seem to leave central banks with more power than before? To understand how crises became opportunities, we have to rewind to a time when central banks didn't exist. For centuries, money was decentralized and imperfect, but it was limited. Gold and silver constrained rulers. Banks could fail. Bad decisions had consequences. Governments overspent. Currencies collapsed fast. When banks took excessive risk, they disappeared. There was no backstop. No lender of last resort. No institution powerful enough to absorb everyone's mistakes. Crises were brutal, but short. And most importantly, they reset the system. That reset was the problem. The earliest central banks weren't created to control economies. They were created to solve one problem: panic. Bank runs destroyed trust. Trust destroyed currencies. Currencies destroyed governments. The solution sounded reasonable. Create an institution that could inject liquidity during emergencies, not to manage markets or shape society, just to calm fear. That was the promise. But hidden inside that promise was a dangerous assumption. If someone can stop panic, they can also decide what must be saved and what must not. The pattern emerged quickly. Crisis hits, the central bank intervenes, markets survive. Relief follows, and with relief comes dependence. Banks adjust their behavior. Governments borrow more. Risk expands quietly. Why? Because the system learned something crucial. Someone else will absorb the downside. This is how emergency tools become permanent expectations, not through conspiracy, but through incentives. Over time, central banks stopped just reacting to crises. They began anticipating them. Interest rates were adjusted preemptively. Markets were guided with forward guidance. A risk was priced assuming there would always be a rescue. The invisible line between stability and control blurred, and few noticed, because nothing broke. Yet then 1971 changed everything. The gold standard ended. Money became pure policy. From that moment on, central banks no longer managed scarcity. They managed expectations. Debt exploded. Markets expanded. Crises were delayed. But delaying crises doesn't remove them. It compounds them. By the late 20th century, a clear playbook existed. First, a crisis erupts. Second, liquidity is injected. Third, rates are cut. Fourth, confidence is restored. And fifth, a new normal is established. Each cycle expanded the central bank's reach. But the most important shift wasn't financial. It was psychological. Markets stopped fearing failure. They feared policy mistakes instead. The 2008 financial crisis didn't just expose risky banks. It exposed the system itself. Derivatives hid leverage. Balance sheets lied. Risk was systemic. When collapse came, central banks faced a choice: let the system reset, or prevent collapse at any cost. They chose prevention. Trillions were created. Assets were purchased. Institutions were rescued. And the line was crossed. Central banks weren't just stabilizers anymore. They were market makers. After 2008, the emergency measures never fully ended. Quantitative easing stayed. Balance sheets remained bloated. Interest rates stayed near zero for years. Each temporary policy quietly became structural. Why? Because removing them caused pain. Pain is politically unacceptable. So the system simply adapted around permanent intervention. Here's the uncomfortable reality. Crises now enable control. They justify expansion. They silence opposition. They compress timelines. What would take decades to achieve politically happens overnight during an emergency. And once implemented, these policies rarely disappear. The pandemic accelerated everything. Spending limits vanished. Debt ceilings evaporated. Money was created at a historic speed. Not because systems improved, but because restraint collapsed. Central banks became the foundation holding everything together. Systems that hold everything control everything. This permanent intervention has consequences. Asset inflation, rising inequality, mispriced risk. Markets no longer reflect reality. They reflect policy. And when policy becomes the market, failure becomes unthinkable, which makes correction impossible. Every proposed solution seems to ignore the core issue. More regulation, digital currencies, rate adjustments. But none of these remove the fundamental incentive problem. The system depends on intervention to survive. Look around today. Debt is higher than ever, growth is slowing, and trust is eroding. We aren't stabilizing crises anymore. We're managing permanent instability. So who benefits from this? Not workers, not savers, not small businesses. The system benefits those closest to liquidity. Those who receive money first. Those who own assets. Those who understand policy timing. This isn't about corruption, it's about design. So here are 3 key takeaways. First, crises don't expand power accidentally. They legitimize it. Second, temporary solutions become permanent when removing them causes pain. And third, control grows fastest when fear is highest. Central banks didn't plan to control everything, but the system evolved toward it. And now, control is required to prevent collapse. Which raises the final question. What happens when the system needs a crisis to survive? If this changed how you see crises, money, and power, subscribe. Because the most permanent changes always arrive labeled temporary.